the city of Seville, devout Catholics are turning themselves in to the authorities. They're confessing to heresy, failure to follow the beliefs of the Catholic Church. But why? The Spanish Inquisition has arrived in Seville.
Inkwizycja jest instytucją narosłą mitami. Nie taka jest straszna, jak ją mawiają niektórzy. To tylko efekt swoistych czasów, mawiają inni. Inni jeszcze mówią, że inkwizycja cywilizowała świat. Jest to absolutnie nieważne. Inkwizycja jest jedynie przykładem. Na temat inkwizycji postaram się opowiedzieć na kolejnym filmie. Chodzi mi o argument, że chrześcijaństwo samo z siebie wyprodukowało nietolerancję i prześladowania. To absolutna nieprawda. Nie miało to miejsca aż do czasów Augustyna, gdy to prześladowania uznano za coś, co jest nieodłączne od chrześcijaństwa na bazie teologicznej. Wystarczy popatrzeć na wiek przykładowo V naszej ery i jakie prześladowania miały tam miejsce na krucjaty przeprowadzone wobec, jak to mawiali, heretyckich odłamów chrześcijaństwa i temu podobne, by zobaczyć, że prześladowania przez chrześcijan na chrześcijanach i niechrześcijanach za wiarę były realne. Czy jednak nie jest to apostazja, by czynić takie okropności? Czy Jezus nie wypowiadał się o takich ludziach, że wydaje im się jedynie, że robią Bogu przysługę, w domyśle, że są przeciwko Bogu i wcale Go nie znają? A kto taki promował tego typu zachowanie?
That's awful. But when Augustine came into the scene and became a major force, there was conflicting opinion over the use of persecution. Though no leading church figure seems to have approved of it or defended it, there was the use of persecution in order to get people to change. In the year 396, Augustine wrote, "I would have no man brought into the Catholic communion against his will." Yet later on, when Augustine changed his ideas about grace, he changed his ideas about persecution. As he came to believe that God effects conversion by force on men's wills, irresistible force, and that God uses force himself in changing their wills from evil to good, so also Augustine came to believe that it was right for God's servants to use force to change people's wills. And by 408 AD, now the first statement, 396, I would have no man brought into the Catholic communion against his will. 396, where does that put him in terms of his age? Got those things there? When he became Bishop of Hippo, when he is first elected as bishop, he makes that statement. Now it is 408 AD. And he writes this to a nonconformist who advocated freedom of conscience. You are of the opinion that no one should be compelled to follow righteousness, yet you read that the householder said to his servants, whomsoever you shall find, compel them to come in. You also read how he who was at first Saul, afterwards Paul, was compelled by the great violence which with Christ coerced him to know and embrace the truth. But you cannot but think that the light which your eyes enjoy is more precious to man than money or other possessions. This light, lost suddenly by him when he was cast to the ground by the heavenly voice, he did not recover until he became a member of the Holy Church. You are also of opinion that no coercion is to be used with any man in order to his deliverance from the fatal consequences of error. And yet you see that in examples which cannot be disputed, this is done by God, who loves us with more real regard for our profit than any other can. And you hear Christ saying, no man can come to me except the Father draw him. Now notice what he's using. He's changing the word from influence to force. Augustine here makes very clear the connection between two major changes in his thinking between 395 and 408 AD. He often repeats this argument that in persecuting nonconformists, the Catholics are but following the example of their Lord. And it is based, of course, on his new ideas about God's sovereign will. Having once come to this conclusion, Augustine was quite resolute in his advocacy of persecution, of confiscation of possessions, and of fear of punishment or pain. To the tribune, Boniface, he wrote, "Is it not part of the care of the shepherd when any sheep have left the flock, to bring them back to the fold of his master when he has found them, by the fear or even the pain of the whip if they show symptoms of resistance? Now there was a group that Augustine really fought against. They were called the Donatists. The Donatist party. They were genuine Christians, but they were not Catholic. And Augustine began to institute a systematic persecution of the Donatists. He took their churches and burned them down. He arrested them and threw them in prison and stripped them of everything they had and sold all their possessions unless they joined the church. And many destitute and persecuted Donatists, understandably desperate, committed suicide by setting light to themselves. A Donatist minister named Gaudentius, under persecution and threat of death, said he would sooner burn down his church with himself and his flock in it than become Catholic. Threatened again with death, he said he did not seek martyrdom, but was prepared for it. Only the hireling flees when he sees the wolf coming, Gaudentius said. Augustine wrote, explaining the suicide impulse must be from the devil. Then he said, this is Augustine, if you suppose that we ought to be moved because so many thousands die in this way, how much more consolation do you think we ought to have because far and incomparably more thousands are freed from the great madness of the Donatist party? It is true that it was the practical success of fear and pain rather than any theological or biblical argument which first led him to support persecution. But whatever caused the actual change in his view, without his new theological system, it would have been very hard to justify. In the mature Augustine, therefore, the state church found not only the first Christian leader of importance to advocate the use of persecution against nonconformists, but they found the only Christian theologian of significance whose theological system would justify such persecution. It is therefore not really surprising that his new ideas made rapid advance within the state church. That by 1424 they dominated the Latin sector of it, and that by 1431 they were adopted for Western Christendom at the Third Ephesian Council. 431 rather. Verduin and others have shown how the arguments Augustine used to support persecution have been repeated throughout history by many of those who adopted other features of his system. They were used by the early Catholic Church, by Luther. Remember Luther saying, wish every Jew was killed, put to death? Horrible things were said by men who were otherwise great men of God. By the Reformers, by Calvin and his associates at Geneva, by the latter Catholics to defend persecution of groups like the Huguenots. Farrar rightly comments, Augustine must bear the fatal charge of being the first as well as the ablest defenders of the frightful cause of persecution and intolerance. He was the first to misuse the words compel them to come in of the parable, a fragmentary phrase wholly unsuited to bear the weight of horror for which it was made responsible. He was the first and ablest asserter of the principle which led to the Albigensian Crusades, the Spanish Armadas, the Netherlands butcheries, the St. Bartholomew massacres, the accursed infamies of the Inquisition, the vile espionage, the hideous bale fires of Seville and Smithfield, the racks, the gibbets, the thumbscrews, the subterranean torture chambers used by churchly torturers who assumed the garb and language of priests with the trade and temper of executioners, to sicken, crush, and horrify the revolted conscience of mankind. It is mainly because of his later intolerance that the influence of Augustine falls like a dark shadow across the century. It is thus that an Arnold of Citeaux, a Torquemada, a Springer, an Alva, a Philip II, a Bloody Mary Tudor, a Charles IX, and a Louis XIV can look up to him as the authorizer of their enormities and quote his sentences to defend some of the vilest crimes which have ever caused men to look with horror on the religion of Christ and the Church of God. The main point is that Augustine, like the pagans, were not suggesting they should be tried for specific crimes, these people, nor even for some vague charge such as incitement to sedition. He was advocating their persecution simply because they were not Catholic. Like Christians in the pagan era, they were persecuted for religious nonconformity, not tried for specific civil offenses. And the scary thing is this, the guys who did this study said this, through the influence and advocacy of Augustine, thousands of simple brethren of Christ were actually caused to be hungry, exiled, strangers, homeless, in prison, or of pain. We may indeed remember Jesus' words, depart from me, you cursed. I was hungered, you gave me no meat. I was thirsty, you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, you took me not in. Naked, you clothed me not. Sick and in prison, you visited me not. And as much as you did it not to one of these least, you did it not unto me. How may we then reconcile the words of Jesus with Renwick's description of Augustine as the greatest Christian of his age? How may we even understand Soter's description of him as the greatest Christian since New Testament times? Even one of our leading evangelists, a man very widely used of God, seems to be affected by the common exaltation of Augustine. He recently wrote, Augustine was one of the greatest theologians of all time. He became one of the great saints of all time. On what are we to base those standards of greatness? And here's the scary thing. Augustine's great contemporary, Chrysostom, said Christians are not to destroy error by force and violence, but should work the salvation of men by persuasion, instruction, and love. In short, Augustine's whole background had been one of tolerance, and he himself was a champion of tolerance early in his Christian life. He abandoned this earlier tolerance to become himself the first great Christian thinker to advocate violence, fear, and pain to spread the gospel. John Calvin had Servetus, Michael Servetus, burnt at the stake. What people do not usually know is they had him burnt over green wood, so it took him 3 hours to be pronounced dead. When this happened, a cry of outrage resounded over most of Europe. A pamphlet was written asking if Christ had now become Moloch to demand human sacrifice, or if we could picture Christ as one of the constables lighting the fire. What Calvin did is not convincing. It becomes the less convincing when we are told often by the same apologists that those like Calvin and Augustine were the most competent Bible scholars in history. Surely if Calvin could write a work hailed as the most systematic treatise on the Christian faith ever written, it is an insult to suggest his moral teaching was not an integral part of his system, but was based on some opinions of contemporary men. If Augustine had the greatness of mind and strength of character to overturn all the Christian teaching of the first 300 years, it is absurd to excuse his advocacy of persecution on the grounds of a spirit in him of conformity. Tragic fact is surely that those who deny any power but God's, and hence reduce everyone, including Satan, to servants of God, may, if times are right, finish by using Satan's own weapons of fear and force, pain and persecution. We must decide for ourselves whether we believe that Augustine or the Christians of the first 3 centuries had the true Pauline doctrines. Our decision in this issue is going to affect our whole attitude to God and his conflict with evil. Is the conflict a real one? Are we really wrestling in Christ against powers of evil? If we are using the weapons of Christ, then what methods does he use for warfare and touching men's souls? These are not merely academic questions, but will have a practical effect on the methods we adopt and on the urgency with which we obey Paul's command to fight the good fight. Very, very key historical study. Now, you tell me this, when we get up to preach about what the Church of Jesus Christ has done, what is the major historical slap in the face that Christians get? The Crusades, the Inquisition, the Armadas. Isn't that what we are accused of being? You say that Christianity is a peaceful blah blah. What about this? What about that? What about that? That's what I'm saying. When you take a position that is not Augustine's, you are flying right against what the world thinks Christianity is. And it's not prepared to handle that at all. Really? So you can see what we're talking about Reformation. This is a real Reformation. Going back earlier than Augustine, earlier than the Reformers. It's going back to something different than what Augustine has said and the church is just simply built on in the Western church, not being true of the other 2 branches of the church, but in the Western church for the last